Hi, I'm David Barr Kirtley, author of the book Save Me Please and Other Stories, and welcome to episode 604 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today on the show, we'll be discussing 6 stories from the book The Best of Greg Egan. And those stories are Silver Fire, Reasons to be Cheerful, Oceanic, Oracle, Singleton, and Dark Integers. And this will include spoilers for all of those stories, so just be aware of that. And this is a follow-up to our previous discussion of The Best of Greg Egan back in episode 592, so definitely check that out if you missed it. And I'm joined today by my good friend Anthony Ha, making his 32nd appearance on the show. His short fiction appears in Lady Churchill's Rosebud Wristlet, and in the chapbook Love Songs for Monsters. And his story A Brief History of the Afterlife recently appeared in the March-April issue of Asimov's magazine. He currently works as weekend editor at TechCrunch, and is a co-host of the podcast Original Content. And now here's our interview with Anthony Ha. All right, so we're here with Anthony Ha. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back. I am excited to talk more about Greg Egan.
Absolutely. Okay, and so the first story we're going to talk about in this batch is called Silver Fire. And so in this story, there's a fairly rare but really horrific disease going around called silver fire. And the US government contacts Claire, our main character, who's an epidemiologist. And they say that there's some weird fluctuations in the data, which lead them to believe that there may be an asymptomatic carrier spreading this disease. And they would like her to run this down and see if that's actually the case. And so she goes around and, questions the family members of people who've been infected and stuff like that, and starts to get the idea that there are these weird raves, and that people may be getting infected at these raves, and that starts her on her investigation. So, Anthony, what'd you think of Silver Fire?
I liked it a lot. And I think, I mentioned in our last review that it does feel like the stories right around this time, at least based on this best of collection, kind of shift into kind of becoming longer and, I think a little bit more narratively driven as opposed to just concept driven, although the concepts are still very strong. And to me, this was like a great example of that, in that it, there's this central mystery of how is not necessarily like the origin of Silver Fire in a broader sense, but just this specific kind of outbreak that seems to be happening, which I found really compelling. And there's like all these like interesting details about the villages. And I mean, the description of Silver Fire itself is horrifying. I mean, I think reading this in 2025 I have to imagine would be very different from reading it in 1995, because obviously we've been through the pandemic. And so a lot of the descriptions of how it spreads, and then at least in my head, I couldn't help comparing that to COVID. I mean, it's nothing like COVID, but just, like, oh, this seems like it doesn't spread as quickly, but obviously it's way more fatal. And so just sort of comparing this sort of imaginary epidemic to the real one, I found pretty fascinating too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you that the details involving the virus all seem very, very heavily researched. I don't know if Greg Egan has any sort of background in public health or anything like that, or if this was all just research, but I totally believed that this character was an epidemiologist, and that all seemed very convincing to me. You mentioned there, like there's a lot of details about the villages. Do you want to just explain for listeners what's going on with the villages?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, and I don't think you get all the details. It's sort of more suggestive than fully described, but that there are these sort of like people, like small groups of people who kind of want to live off the like sort of have a kind of a different level of technology than the rest of civilization. So they've sort of withdrawn, but it's not just like, they're not like Amish or something like that. There's still a lot of tech, and they also have, actually, I'm realizing now I'm blanking. Are they low tech or are they high tech?
Well, no, it's like they all. My recollection is that they all work online. They're all people who work from home, basically, and they form into these kind of communes of all people who work online. This is again, this is 1995, so this is pretty forward thinking, I guess. But yeah, I think they have these like digital like wall screens like Claire's never seen before. So I think it's fair to say they're pretty high tech.
Right. I guess maybe that's where I was a little, it's not exactly what I expected, because I think there is a sense of having withdrawn from society in some ways, because they are these sort of small communes. But I guess, yeah, they're not like disavowing technology anyway. In fact, maybe the opposite. And then on top of that, there are these specific events that they like, these big parties that then draw people who maybe aren't even from the villages who come, and there are these raves. And like you said, there are these digital walls. And one of the like cool effects that he describes is the idea that you would see the rave from, in a different village on one wall, and then you see a different rave on the other wall. And so it's about the idea of creating the illusion that you're all sharing the same space, that there's, raves happening all over the country. And then it's one that through the magic of technology, it's all happening in one place.
Yeah, so it's sort of a hall of mirrors effect where you're just looking from one room into another, into another, into another, all spread out in all directions all over the country. So I thought that was really cool. So I was really into this story up till that point.
Okay.
And I felt like it went a little bit off the rails after that. I think the first thing that kind of sounded a wrong note for me was there's a line about Claire thinks about how Silverfire has kind of hit the mainstream because it was featured in NBC's hit sci-fi drama Mutilated Mystic Empaths in End Space. And I just thought this was such a silly, I feel like Greg Egan is unable to restrain himself from expressing his disdain for, like Hollywood science fiction. But it's just such broad satire there that it just sort of struck again, a wrong note for me in this otherwise very like deadly serious, completely believable story. And then so basically, yeah, it turns out that that there's kind of this cult of people in these villages who are intentionally spreading this virus. They have, I was a little vague on all the details here, but they have something called the Trail of Happiness. And so they're sort of spreading the virus in a like geographic pattern that mirrors the Trail of Tears, the forced march of Native Americans by the U.S. government, in a way that's is somehow supposed to kind of like atone for it or take revenge for it or something like that. But so how Claire finds out about this is that basically one of the cultists just like explains the whole thing to her apropos of nothing. And that just seems really, really weird. I couldn't understand what his motive, like granted he was like on drugs and everything, but it just seemed really, really like kind of inexplicable to me. So I don't know if you had a different reaction to that or what.
So I agree that the ending didn't fully work for me. I think that sort of central image just of, they're basically like transporting this person around and, spreading, and people are sort of voluntarily getting infected, and that Claire is like, this person is in unbelievable pain and you should end their life, to be kind. And they're like, no, they're ecstatic. And just that central image I found really powerful and haunting. I agree that the mechanics, there's some degree of convenience. Maybe it also bothered me less because the people involved who are spreading it don't see it as doing something wrong. I mean, they're not necessarily broadcasting it all over the internet or TV, but I think on some level, as I understood their behavior, which again, there's some fuzziness. I don't think it's revenge, but how it connects to the Trail of Tears, I couldn't tell you exactly. I do think they see it more as a kind of salvation, and that they're sort of setting people free from like the prison of the flesh or something like that. But I think that they see it as they're sort of evangelists for this. And so it made sense to me that when she actually found them, they would just be like, yeah, do you want some of this salvation?
I guess that makes sense at some. I mean, it just seems to me that they must be aware that what they're doing is illegal and will get shut down if it, if they talk to the wrong person about it. But I don't know. I guess you never know with cultists. But that seemed very weird to me. And then, so like you said, yeah, what happens at the very end is that Claire, throughout the story, is wondering what the mechanism could be for spreading this virus. And it turns out how they're spreading it is like you said, they have someone who's infected, who's kind of like in a induced coma, I think, in a like van, and they're just driving this van from party to party, spreading the virus that way. And so, I didn't have any issue with that ending plot wise, but I did have an issue where she kind of like decides she's gonna like raid the van herself, without calling for backup or anything. It's sort of the story kind of tries to justify it, but I didn't really buy that she would actually do this rather than calling for backup. And then I literally turned the last page and I was startled that the story was over. I thought there was going to be more. So so I don't know. Overall, I ended up feeling like this was one of the weaker Greg Egan stories that I've read. Just because I found the ending, just sort of abrupt and I don't know. And I will say actually, like, so last time we talked about Greg Egan's endings, that I thought he had a really good ending for a lot of his stories, which is that the main character, having seen through to the underlying reality that we're all just biological machines, can no longer appreciate human sentiment or emotional connection in the way that they once could, which I thought was a really good ending, but he just used it over and over and over, to the degree that it kind of lost its impact for me. So I was glad that he didn't just keep recycling that same ending in these stories, but I often felt that the endings were not home runs, and we'll get into that, I guess, as we go through these individual stories. But yeah, I would say I liked all the other stories in this batch more than Silverfire.
Interesting. I mean, we'll get to it. There is another story in this batch where I had a reaction that maybe was similar to yours, in that I liked a lot of the story and then I disliked the ending so much that it really soured me on the rest of the story. But for some reason, I think, even though I think a lot of what you're saying about the ending, I think those are valid criticisms. And I do think there was a little bit of a sense of he maybe had already gone longer than he was expecting to. And there's a certain sense of like, all right, like, well, I've revealed it. Let's just end the story. And it wasn't a totally satisfying ending. And I also have the sort of plausibility concern, which just in general, it seemed like Claire, like through the whole story, I'm terrified that Claire is going to get Silverfire. And then at a certain point, it kind of dawned on me that she doesn't seem worried about this at all, and like never seems to be taking any kind of precautions. And, that sort of reaches its peak in sort of her just kind of walking over to the van at the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a little more, up until the point where she raids the van, I think it makes sense, because we're told that this is a fairly difficult disease to spread, and you have to physically touch somebody for it to have even a small chance of spreading. And I think the fact that she's an epidemiologist, it's reasonable that she's a little bit more, just blasé about viruses, thinking about them and working around them all the time. So that wasn't a huge issue for me. But I just, the fact that, like, I felt like it was completely obvious to me that someone was intentionally spreading the virus from pretty early on.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think part of it, because I know that this is a work of fiction, and that's a more interesting thing to happen in a work of fiction. So she doesn't know that she's in a work of fiction, but it still, I did sort of wonder why it took her so long to realize that, when it did seem pretty plain to me.
Right. Yeah. And I guess that part of it is that she just cannot conceive of why someone would do that. And And again, that gets back to, I mean, there's something about that idea that's so horrifying that makes it kind of powerful. But I do think the explanation is a little bit muddled. And it also feels a little bit like in this set of stories, I think there's a number of them where you mentioned him sort of having a little bit of an axe to grind with Hollywood science fiction, which I think definitely is true in this one. I think he just also more broadly seems to have a lot of skepticism of the humanities and social sciences, and that there's like in multiple stories there's sort of like a cartoonish kind of humanities academic character who just says kind of ridiculous things. And I think in this story they're not necessarily meant to be directly responsible, but it seems like he's kind of suggesting that they're part of the same phenomenon, that like in this age of sort of scientific discovery, there's like such a vacuum that people just believe complete bullshit, and that the idea that essentially that they've sort of bought into this as the motivation for spreading this disease.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Greg Egan is really hostile to religion and like mysticism or whatever, like new age kind of stuff, whatever you would want to call it, which I mean, I'm totally sympathetic to that view, but it does make the work a little bit predictable in a way, because you know it's not going to turn out that the religion is true or the mysticism is true or something. That's just kind of like baked into his worldview in all of the stories.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so let's move on to the second story in this batch, Reasons to be Cheerful. So in this story, there's a guy, we get his childhood. When he's a child, he just starts experiencing just happiness all the time. He's just really, really happy for no apparent reason. And then, so it turns out that actually he has a brain tumor, which is why he's so happy. This brain tumor is connected to his brain in such a way that it's stimulating the release of some, neurotransmitters or something that's making him really happy. And so he has to get the tumor removed, and his parents spring for some expensive new treatment, which is supposed to be really good. But it kind of has the unfortunate side effect of kind of frying his happiness, the happiness part of his brain. And so then he's totally unable to experience any kind of happiness, no matter what happens to him. And this situation continues for 18 years until a doctor contacts him with a new experimental procedure, which will hopefully restore his capacity to feel happiness. And he agrees to undergo this new procedure. So, Anthony, what did you think of Reasons to be Cheerful?
I love this story. I mean, it I think is maybe my favorite Egan story, in that I think it sort of marries a couple of different strands that I find interesting. One is just, that it's, this kind of conceptual rigor around the idea of, of us being essentially sort of biological machines, and really in a lot of mostly unsentimental ways kind of exploring that. But then I think a little bit more room to explore the character side of it in this one. I think there's also just some, again, like a lot of the details, which again, I don't know if they come out of research or imagination, are just really compelling. Like when he describes the surgery and like basically first like removing parts of his brain and then having this other material that kind of comes in and reactivates the happy parts of his brain. I thought that was like really horrifying and haunting again. I think, and then just there's something about, especially the last section, which is that now he has these controls over his happiness. And he gets to decide, do I want to like this thing, and how much do I want to like it? I think it's just so kind of philosophically interesting, because I think what the best Greg Egan stories do are not just sort of kind of hammering home the idea, hey, we're biological machines, but it's also saying, okay, if you accept that, then what do you do with it? What does that mean to you? Because Mark at the end of the story is somebody who now in some ways is in a great situation. He's in kind of complete control of his life, but it sort of prompts in some ways this separate existential crisis of just, well, does it mean anything? If I can make myself attracted to this woman, then is our connection completely fake, or is it just as meaningful as any other romantic connection? And I found all of that really interesting.
Yeah, I agree that by far for me the most compelling part of the story was this idea of if you could have the power to program what makes you happy, what should you choose, and what does that mean for just the whole concept of being happy in general. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and I actually wanted more of that. But overall, I really liked the way that the story explored that idea. It's funny you say that this is maybe your favorite Egan story, because Greg Egan agrees with you. In a 2009 interview, he said that this is his favorite short story that he's written. I'll just read this author's note. He says, with reasons to be cheerful, I spent a few years wondering how to write a story about what it would be like to be able to choose precisely what makes you happy before it struck me that that condition would be far more vivid and poignant if the protagonist had first lost the ability to be happy at all. So that's interesting to me that he spent literally years thinking about this idea before writing this story.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I agree that it seems like he'd really kind of thought it through, and that it wasn't just sort of described in an academic way, but like even especially the section both on the depression and the euphoric happiness before that, both of those also just, I mean, I don't know to what extent he's experienced those things, but the writing in those sections is also just really good. Like it really feels like deeply felt. It's not just sort of like a quick description.
Yeah, and so this is a story, like we're going to see a couple more coming up where you see sort of years of the person's life, like a sweep of history, which I think he does really well. And then there's also, as you mentioned, there's this romantic relationship after he's had this procedure where he can now, assign numerical values to different things to decide how happy he wants them to make him. And so what happens plot wise is that he's dating this woman and it seems to be going really well. But then at a certain point, he reveals to her his whole medical history and everything. And she seems to be totally cool with it. But then afterwards, she calls him and says, I think this is just more than I can handle right now, and breaks things off. And then I think he sort of reconciles with his father. I think, his parents had kind of felt bad about, giving him this treatment, even though it was supposed to be really good, and what happened to him as a result. And so I think there was some sort of some level of distance there. And so I think that's sort of my recollection is that sort of gets that rift sort of gets repaired a little bit at the end.
Yeah, I don't think it's like a full reconciliation, but his father comes to visit him, and it seems like this is something that hasn't happened in a long time. I mean, partly because his parents, I think, basically when he was like the most depressed a person can be while still being alive. And so I don't think he really saw his parents much then, and he hasn't really reconnected with them while he's sort of figuring out his life as a guy who can control his own happiness.
Mm-hmm. So I really liked everything about the story. I felt like the ending again was like, it didn't end with a bang or anything. It sort of, the ending felt a little understated, a little bit, I don't know, I don't know, I thought it was okay, but it didn't blow me away. So I don't know. Did you love the ending, or how did you feel about the last little bits?
I like the ending a lot because I do think, not that it's like a big conceptual breakthrough, but it felt like the right note for the story to end on, that it wasn't this big epiphany that he had, but you get the sense that he is on the road to making sense of his condition now and reconciling himself to it, and sort of repairing some of the damage that happened, rebuilding his life after that, both after the depression, but also after sort of being forced to kind of question what does my happiness even mean now that I can control it? And so it was definitely a quieter ending, but compared to Silverfire, where it does feel a little bit like he just kind of ran out of space, this actually felt like the right emotional note to end on.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I just wanted more, and maybe that's that's a testament to the quality of the story. And maybe if I had gotten more, I would have been like, no, it would have been fine to have less. But yeah, it's hard to say, I guess, without having different versions of the story to compare. But yeah, I thought it was really, really good overall, and yeah, I maybe wanted more exploration of the concept, and maybe like more with his relationship with his girlfriend. But maybe it's just a sign of how good the story is that it left me wanting more.
Yeah, I mean, I would say about all these stories, even the ones, and I swear there will be some that I have more critical things to say about, but I think pretty much all of them, even though they're, either novella length or close to novella length, I think they all feel like very full. And I don't think any of them I felt like they were overlong. And so, yeah, whatever other criticisms I have, they all feel like they really sort of justify their length. I have this other weird thing about Reasons to be Cheerful, which is that I read it for the first time, I don't know, maybe like 20 years ago in an anthology, and then hadn't reread it for so long that in my head I'd switched it to being a Ted Chiang story. And so I remember when I bought Ted's collections, and I was like, "Where's Reasons to be Cheerful?" And it's so funny now, like reading it in this context, and it's so obviously a Greg Egan story.
Well, right, because I started reading it, and my initial, reaction was like, "Oh no, it's another Greg Egan like experiment that affects your perception, and it's going to turn out at the end that, the character having had his perception, having seen through to the underlying reality that we're all just biological machines, can no longer experience human emotions and sentimentality the way he once could." So I was glad that it, that it didn't go there, that it did something different. But I'm also glad that Greg Egan, in the rest of these stories, is branching away from that idea of these medical experiments and how they change your perception, and getting into sort of branching out a little bit more into different concepts.
Yeah, it feels in some ways like with this story, he took that about as far as he could take it. I mean, maybe there'll be something in the last batch that also has a medical procedure that I really like.
Last batch will just be all medical procedure stories.
I mean, at times that's kind of how the first batch felt. So, yeah, I think this is like a very, very good version of that story. And he doesn't, I think, yeah, it's great that then he felt like he could sort of explore other things.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to our next story, Oceanic. So this is definitely a departure from what we've read. This is a far future science fiction story set on an alien planet. And so it's set on this alien planet called Covenant. And all the characters are humans. They're the descendants of terraformers or settlers who came thousands and thousands of years ago. And the human settlement of this planet happened so long ago that it's all shrouded in myth and religion. But we're sort of reading between the lines. We're given to understand that what actually happened was that, colonists came from Earth and genetically engineered themselves and have been living on the planet ever since. The planet is mostly ocean with some islands, I think. And so the people who live in the ocean are called freelanders, and the people who live on land are called firmlanders. Is that the right type of terms?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And the freelanders, they have these sort of like genetically engineered, they're called boats, but they seem to be some sort of genetically engineered, I don't know, like dolphin things or something that they use as boats. And then, like I said, there's this whole layer of religion where in their religion, which has different denominations, they believe that like they can't, like angels like led them to this planet as sort of a promised land. And there's this like Jesus-like figure named Beatrice who somehow died for their sins in some sort of drowning event. And so that's sort of the setup. So Anthony, what do you think of Oceanic?
Okay, this will be the last one where I just say this is a great story, which I do think it's a great story. I will preemptively say I do think that maybe like some of the other stories, it doesn't necessarily know exactly where to end. I think the ending is fine, but I think that this. I mean, I feel like this could have been a novel. There, the world itself is sort of like so richly realized. I'm like you. I'm an atheist, although I sort of was raised Christian and also had a sort of moment in my adolescence where I realized I wasn't a believer anymore. And before we recorded, you sent me a link to this article that Greg Egan wrote. It sounds like he kind of, not necessarily in adolescence, but maybe went through kind of a similar journey that the protagonist of this story does. And I found all of that like very believable, and that I think sometimes when non-believers write, especially science fiction, about religious characters, it can feel a little bit condescending, not believable, and I felt like that he was able to like really convince me that he was inhabiting Martin's consciousness, and we sort of understood Martin's perspective as a believer. I mean, I think I could almost imagine a version of, well, I don't know. I think the one thing maybe I quibble with besides the ending is the fact that then Martin is sort of involved in, making this huge, scientific discovery, which is that the like religious euphoria that he felt was something that, was essentially kind of caused by things in the water. It felt like it's not that it was unbelievable, but it's sort of like that so much of the story feels like a smaller, more character driven story. And so to have this huge kind of earth shaking discovery happen in the middle of it and to have him be so critical to it felt like that it wasn't unbelievable, but it's sort of like a mismatch in terms of like the scale of the story. But ultimately that didn't bother me that much. I think it was just something I had, didn't totally, that threw me off a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I love this story. This is, I think, definitely one of my favorite Greg Egan stories. And I guess I'll just mention, so the Greg Egan essay that you mentioned there, it's called "Born Again Briefly," if anyone wants to go check it out. But so basically, what happens at the beginning of the story is that the main character Martin, who's like 13 or something, has an older brother that he really looks up to, who's become a like fundamentalist or some sort of hardcore, religious believer, and persuades Martin to undergo this drowning ceremony, or this like near drowning ceremony, and in emulation of Beatrice, this god like figure that they believe in. And so Martin undergoes this drowning experience and experiences this like euphoric feeling that Beatrice is with him, that he carries with him for years afterwards. And Greg Egan says in this essay, I mean, that all this stuff is basically autobiographical, that he did have a brother that he really looked up to, and they would talk late into the night about philosophy and science and religion, and his brother, convinced him to get down on his knees and accept Jesus as his personal savior, and that he felt this sense of purpose and joy and acceptance that just sort of very gradually attenuated over time. So I mean, he is obviously drawing on person, and it's like so rare to find out anything personal about Greg Egan. So it was really like sort of striking to find out how autobiographical this actually was. But yeah, I agree with all that stuff was great. I mean, I think it is really, commonplace to have a science fiction story where there's some religion that turns out to be a complete sham. And so it's not like groundbreaking or anything that the story does that. But I just think the story is so well executed that that the somewhat pedestrian nature of that plot is just totally compensated for by just how specific and persuasive basically the world building and the characters are. in the story. So I would say everyone has to read the story. I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah, and as you talk about how familiar that basic plot or trope is, I think one of the other things that makes this version more believable is what happens in the aftermath of the revelation, which is not that everyone immediately is just, great, like we're all atheists now, but every single faction, every religion kind of has a different take on it, and also the responses are very personal, and which I think I've been thinking more and more about sort of this narrative that is common, not just in science fiction, but certainly in science fiction, of like, some sort of scandal is revealed or the truth is revealed, and then the world immediately, you sort of just take it as given that the world is immediately changed. And I think one thing, maybe that's always been true, but has become increasingly clear to me, is that all of that is sort of mediated through our own biases, through the media itself, through politics. And so the fact that he could have this, earth-shaking discovery, and then there's still plenty of believers, is to me by far the most believable version of that. And then we see that also in the small scale in the ending, where he goes and he go through this pool that's supposed to have these like mystical powers, but you have to be very careful with it. But he goes in and just completely covers himself with water, which you're not supposed to be able to do. And he says it's all fake. But most of the people stay. But he notices that this, one girl who was in line decides that she's at least there's some seed of skepticism has been planted. And I think that's like a much more believable model of how people change their minds.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of reminds me of, in so many science fiction stories, there will be some like dystopian society, and then the heroes reveal some information or some scandal, and the whole dystopian society crumbles instantly. And it's like, no, this is just not how, unfortunately, this is not how life works. So yeah, but you mentioned also earlier that Greg Egan seems to have a bone to pick with the humanities, and at this point in the story, there's a clear dig at postmodernism, where one of the reactions is for one of the believers to say, well, really every story is just as good as any other story. Like they're all equally true in a way, and yeah, that seemed pretty transparent. Who he was, the kind of academic he was thinking of there. But so all that stuff is cool, like not not necessarily groundbreaking, but as I said, just executed so well that I was just thrilled to read the story. Another aspect of the story that we haven't really touched on yet is that the people on this planet have been genetically engineered to be hermaphrodites, basically. Like, so basically everybody is capable of getting pregnant and giving birth. And then some people have penises and some don't. And then every time you have sex, your penis basically like switches to the other person, and then they go off and then they have a penis. And so this was done, I think the implication is to sort of try to make the society more like gender egalitarian, where everybody is sharing the risks and the burdens of childbirth. And so actually I read this story when it appeared in Asimov's magazine, which would have been, it was a long time ago.
98,
I have it here. 98. And so that was actually the one part of the story that I remembered. I didn't remember any of the stuff about Beatrice or, the euphoria or the religion being fake. I just remembered, and it's like not foreshadowed really at all. Martin is just having sex for the first time, and all of a sudden his penis like breaks off, and you're just like, what is going on? What is going on here? It's like you mentioned last time about Greg Egan has a certain level of body horror in his work, and that was definitely some body horror for me right there. But I just thought that was such a like weird, memorable, interesting idea. They call it the bridge, like the basically the penis like structure is called a bridge, and it switches back and forth, and there's a certain amount of interesting like sociological treatment of that of what that would mean. And I found that so compelling. I wish that there was more of it. Like I said, that was kind of the thing that really stuck with me from the story, and it's very much sort of a sort of an incidental detail to the plot. But like you said, this could have been this could have been a novel for sure. I think it's great the way it is, but there was definitely so much world building in this that it definitely could have supported more, a bigger plot if Greg Egan had been interested in going in that direction.
Yeah, it's funny because I also read Oceanic. I don't remember if it was I think maybe I read it in Asimov's when it came out. And then it was also, I think, in A Year's Best. And I read it again then, but then hadn't read it in, what is that, 20, 25, 27 years, essentially. And the thing is, I had remembered all the religious stuff and forgotten the bridge. And so there was a sense of like, oh, I know what this story is. This is very good. This is very good. And then I got to the sex scene and I was completely unprepared and just, yeah, and it's interesting because I think he doesn't treat it in a sort of like prurient or kind of horrific way at all. Like he's not like snickering at it, but it's just like he describes what happens in a few sentences in a fairly clinical way. And that is, I mean, I don't know how a woman react to it, but as a guy, that's like a pretty horrific description. And then he moves on, and then, like you said, he has this whole dynamic around the idea of like, because that's essentially, the first time that happens, you're both like sort of as the person who brought the bridge, you've now lost the bridge, you've lost your virginity. And then it's like visible, not to everyone, but to any other partners in this much more obvious way. And then there's this idea of, maybe wanting to get it back. And I just found all of that like really interesting.
Well, yeah, it was interesting for me since I knew what was coming to see what bits of foreshadowing there were. And there's very little. I mean, right before that happens, there's a wedding, Martin witnesses a wedding ceremony. And during the wedding ceremony, he just makes sort of an offhand comments about like, this person was my mother, but so-and-so's father and stuff like that, that, if you don't know what you're looking for, you could just kind of like skim over and not particularly think about. And then there's a line during the wedding ceremony where the officiant, whatever, says like, who brings a bridge to this wedding? So it is really interesting. And yeah, and like I said, I mean, it's stuck with that image stuck with me for 27 years. So, anything that sticks with you that long has some sort of power to it.
I don't believe that I will ever forget it again.
Yeah, you better not forget it now.
That's right. We should also mention, I think this is the only story of his that has won a Hugo Award, which I think he probably deserves more Hugos, but this is certainly very worthy.
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, I wish, I don't know if he's written more, like far future, outer space, planetary romance, almost kind of science fiction, but I think he does it incredibly well here. So I would definitely be interested in seeing more. It's the only one out of any of the stories that we've read for this podcast so far that is, far future alien world or anything like that.
Which, I mean, makes it really striking that it's in that setting that he also then essentially smuggled in all this autobiographical stuff. I mean, I don't know that maybe there's other autobiographical things in the other stories, but this is in some ways the least likely candidate for autobiographical material.
Well, knowing how autobiographical this is makes me think a lot of the other stories are probably autobiographical too. But since we know nothing of his biography, we'll never know.
Yeah, exactly.
But maybe someday he'll release his like 10-volume autobiography, and then we can all know.
Or Greg, you can come on Geek's Guide, and then you can tell us the truth.
Yeah, that would be great. Okay. Next story is called Oracle. I don't know if you saw my note, not first person, exclamation.
I saw that, which this is something that I felt as soon as you said it, I couldn't not see it, but that hadn't even occurred to me. But I remember reading Oracle and feeling like, wow, this feels very different from the other stories. But because I think there are things that I'm very attentive to as a reader, but one of the things I'm generally not is, I think, first versus third. They both feel very natural to me. So I didn't consciously realize that he'd made that switch.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I didn't notice while I was reading any of the stories, but after as I was putting my notes together, I was like, wait, were any of the stories in this because none of the stories last time, or all the stories last time, were first person, and so I was like, wait, was every story this time first person? And so I went through and like, no, wait, Oracle was not first person, and I think it's because there's two characters who are sort of equally important as viewpoint characters, so it was kind of more natural to tell this story in a third person, from a third person point of view.
Exactly.
But so the setup here is that there's a brilliant British scientist named Robert Stoney, who is very obviously modeled on Alan Turing, and he's I guess if anyone doesn't know, Alan Turing was a brilliant mathematician and a pioneer in computing, whose discoveries helped crack the German Enigma code and win World War II. And he was later persecuted by the British government for being a homosexual. And so this character, Robert Stoney, is obviously shares basically all of those characteristics. And so as the story opens, he's being basically tortured by a British intelligence officer because of his homosexuality. And a mysterious woman, appears and helps him escape. And in the course of this escape, or maybe shortly thereafter, she reveals that she's a robot from the future, and it's important that technological progress happens faster than it would have without her intervention. And so she's come to kind of give him hints to help him make all sorts of important discoveries that need to happen sooner than they would have otherwise. And so then he's inventing all this crazy stuff that no one's ever seen before, thanks to her intervention. And this arouses the suspicion of John Hamilton, who is a Cambridge literature professor, who's and Christian apologist, who's very obviously modeled on C.S. Lewis. And he comes to suspect that the Robert Stoney character is able to invent all this stuff because he's in league with the devil. And this sets the two on a collision course. So Anthony, what did you think of Oracle?
Yeah, so this was the first one that I felt a lot more ambivalent about. I think in a lot of ways it still really works well as a story. I was never bored with it. I found a lot of it to be really compelling. I think that in a lot of ways, he's just trying to do too much here, which I mean, I sort of just applaud that he was trying to do it, but that this is, has this sort of historical component of giving us these sort of alternate versions of Alan Turing and C.S. Lewis and kind of setting them on a collision course. It has this kind of time travel plot. It also has this sort of multiple worlds theory, which I think is maybe the first story in this collection where we start to get into multiple worlds, which I think becomes much bigger in some of the later stories. But it just feels like I think maybe part of it is at least at this length. I was so interested in Robert Stoney, the Alan Turing stand-in, and I thought that opening section about just that's not. I mean, I don't know how much it's based in historical reality, but isn't sort of openly science fictional. But it's just basically describing this character's kind of imprisonment and torture by the government for being homosexual. I thought that was all really, really strong and interesting. And then, when he's rescued and Helen shows up and there's this idea of, hey, this is a society that's kind of on a bad future, or sort of on a bad timeline, and we want to set it right. That was all really interesting and promising. And then all the C.S. Lewis stuff was also interesting, but it felt like actually it wasn't necessarily additive to the Turing story. And to me, it felt like we kind of got pulled into a completely different story, which was also interesting, but not necessarily the one that I'd been hoping for.
Yeah, I don't, you say this works really well as a story. I don't know if it really works as a story.
Well, or I guess it works as
at all.
It works as it holds your attention. Maybe
it works as a fascinating piece of writing.
Yes.
For sure. Yeah. So I mean, yeah, I don't even know how to describe. Like, I was thinking, like this almost feels like a like a recipe where you like put all the ingredients in a bowl and you're supposed to stir it for 5 minutes and you didn't, and all the ingredients are all kind of like there's just big blobs of carrots or like whatever it is, and they're not kind of like mixed together the way that they should be. But all the ingredients are really tasty. I don't know if that's too strained of a metaphor there, but I mean, yeah, it's a really, I don't think like in plot terms it works very well. Like I got to the end and I was just kind of like, what the heck was that? But like everything in it is really interesting. I mean, obviously, I think Greg Egan just had 5 or 6 ideas that he wanted to explore and explored them in a really interesting way. And I don't know, that they add up to anything greater than the sum of their parts, but the pieces on their own are all. I'm glad I read it. It's all like really interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think maybe that's what when I said works as a story, I meant like held my attention. And while I was reading it, I thought I was reading something really interesting and provocative. And then I got to the end and I was like, oh, that feels like not quite the right ending for that story. And then I started to think more about just all the different pieces. I was like, oh yeah, like I don't know that any of that really paid off in a thematically satisfying way.
Yeah, I do think, again, like you were saying with Oceanic, that he did a good job of portraying a religious believer in a kind of sophisticated, respectful, interesting way. I don't think he really did in this story. Like, I don't know. Maybe,
I agree.
like, just, I mean, I'm not at all persuaded by, demonic anything. So maybe I'm particularly not interested by that, but just when the C.S. Lewis character thinks that the devil is influencing events, it just seems silly to me. And I know that people actually believe that, but it didn't make me interested to read it necessarily. And especially so, what happens at the end is that the C.S. Lewis character, his wife has died, and he's visited by like a version of himself from a alternate timeline where he accepted Robert Stoney's help and was able to cure her through medical, like breakthrough medical advances. And the alternate version invites him to come along to this timeline where his wife is still alive. And he says, no, he's still persuaded that this is the devil's handiwork. And yeah, it just seemed kind of silly to me. But the thing actually that really riveted me about the story was the idea that this Helen character, this robot from the future, she says that her mechanical brain is configured in such a way that when she makes decisions, it does not result in the timeline branching in a many worlds interpretation way. So like basically the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics states that, anytime any event of any measurable scale happens in the universe, that the universe splits into multiple versions covering an infinity of possibilities. And so one implication of this is that, I guess we're going to get into this a lot more in the next story. But one implication of this is that basically anytime you do anything, there are other versions of yourself that do pretty much anything else you could imagine in a way that could be seen as canceling each choice being canceled out by all these other choices. And so this Helen robot doesn't experience the world in that way. And so I thought that was really interesting. And apparently Greg Egan did too, because he wrote a whole other story about that we're going to get to in just one second. But I think part of the reason I really liked this story was just I thought that idea was really interesting. And it was just in the stew of really interesting ideas that this story presented.
Right. I think in this batch, in general, it seems like it became clear that it seemed that at least in the period that he was writing, he sort of had 2 great obsessions. One was sort of, again, the idea of kind of, the extent to which ourselves are determined by biology. And then over time, it seemed like, many worlds theory like kind of became the other obsession. And it's interesting because at first I was like, I don't really understand. Like, is it just that he happened to be obsessed with one and then the other? But then they do feel connected as I think about it, because they're both connected to our ideas of free will. and both of them are these sort of, if you accept, these sort of the idea that everything you think, feel is determined by biology, and then also if you believe that that there's just all these multiple versions of yourselves making different decisions, then that's essentially this double whammy that says like choice is completely meaningless.
Yeah. So Greg Egan is just really hitting us with every reason to feel that your life is pointless and that your decisions don't matter.
Exactly.
Like he's drawn like a moth to a flame to anything that reinforces those ideas.
I mean, I suspect he probably believes that too. I mean, certainly the biological one.
Yeah. But I'll go back again to my earlier point about not all the Greg Egan endings being home runs. Like this one was not a home run for me, and I think that this story sort of lays bare the most clearly the problem I think he has plotting, which is that I feel like he has a certain number of interesting ideas that he wants to explore. And then once he's explored those ideas, that's kind of, where all the passion has gone. And it's kind of like, oh yeah, now I got to like wrap this thing up. And it feels like, like traditionally a story, you would want it to build and build and build. And then the ending, you have the big climax where it's the emotional tenor is at its most intense and everything. And I think Greg Egan is just not interested in that at all. He's not interested in the emotional, pitch being raised to its highest point. He's interested in exploring the ideas. And so, I think that a lot of these endings, just feel a little bit random or lacking in drama, because that's not where his real interest lies.
Yeah, I wonder if it's. I think what you're talking about is very real. I think that I wonder how much of it's a reflection of his interest and also just sort of the ending that he can believe, that maybe the sort of bigger, more dramatic ending that sort of wraps things up more neatly is something that he just can't maybe bring himself necessarily to believe in.
Yeah. Well, if you would just come on this podcast, we could get to the bottom of all this.
Yeah. There are two other things I wanted to mention about Oracle quickly. One is, I think my favorite thing in the story and one of the best pieces of writing, which doesn't have anything to do with the science fictional stuff, is in the opening section about Robert Stoney being tortured. There's this passage where he talks about how he got ensnared by the government. And basically it's about the idea that it may seem realistic to give in to blackmail initially, but as soon as you sort of open that door, you're just completely trapped and no one can ever trust you again. And I just found it this very almost, again, probably colored by 2025, like this very moving, rationalist explanation for why you need moral courage sometimes, at least in that specific context. But I think you can apply it more broadly. So I thought that was just like a really great piece of writing. And then I think one part of my frustration with the story, beyond all the things that you said too, is also that so Helen appears and says, again, this is sort of a bad timeline. We're going to fix it. And then what that seems to mean is basically sharing all these technologies and scientific discoveries. And then I think that's like a very complicated idea, especially when we've already been introduced to the fact that there's these very dark things about society there in terms of, the homophobia, like how the government treats people. And I think that there's this assumption that by sort of just sharing all this knowledge, we're going to create a more enlightened and free society. And I think there is certainly an argument to be made for that. And I was kind of hoping the story would explore whether or not that's true. And instead, that just sort of gets dropped. And it's just, we're just sort of taken as an assumption that like the vision that Robert Stoney and Helen are pushing for is ultimately going to be a utopian one. I think they mention in passing that the anti-sodomy laws might get repealed, and I was like, wait, how is that happening? Is that really just by like scientific discovery that happens? I'm not entirely convinced.
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, because you think of Greg Egan as being this totally like non-sentimental, like non-romantic kind of clear-eyed, you know, writer. But yeah, I think that's an interesting point you make, that maybe he does have this, at least a little bit of the sort of tech utopian kind of, you know, very deep down, you know, he might be like a little bit of a tech utopian kind of person at heart, and that is sort of coming through in this story in this sort of unexamined kind of way. Yeah, that hadn't occurred to me, but I think that's a really interesting observation. I think there was one other thing. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention is that there's really no indication in the story, if you don't already know who Alan Turing is and C.S. Lewis is, that these characters are based on them. I mean, like, if you know anything about them, it's really obvious, but I wonder what the experience would be like of a young person who is not familiar with them reading the story. And especially, there's even an author's note at the end where Greg Egan says, you know, for this story, I drew on biographies by so and so and so and so, but he doesn't give the titles of the biographies. So even reading that author's note would not point you toward Alan Turing and C.S. Lewis if you didn't already know who they were. So I thought that was kind of an interesting choice. Or
yeah, it was. It's sort of. I was a little confused about just like changing the names. I mean, maybe that's just how he imagines these sort of parallel worlds, or maybe he just thought that, especially because he was going to be so hard on C.S. Lewis, he ought to change the name. But yeah, it's like there's not a lot of clues. There is one thing towards the end I remember where Helen then lays out for Stoney, like, oh, this is what your life was like in another universe, and that's, you know, Alan Turing's life. So if you suspect that it's Alan Turing, that will confirm it. But if you didn't know that, yeah, you might. I was imagining somebody just sort of Googling the biographers and kind of going down the list and being like, is it this person? Is it this person? Is it this person?
Yeah, it's funny. I was definitely confused about what exactly was going on with the relationship between these characters to their, you know, to their inspirations. I mean, like, he even has C.S. Lewis's books, but they're all given slightly different names. So it's like, instead of the Screw Tape Letters, it's Letters to a Demon. Instead of Out of the Silent Planet, it's The Broken Planet. So yeah, and especially since it's a science fiction story, you're sort of like, wait, is this explained by, is this just a literary conceit, or is this explained by some branch of the timeline somehow or something? Yeah, it did take me most of the way through the story before I'm like, okay, it's just a literary conceit, I think.
Right. Or I mean, it's weird because I still couldn't tell you.
Yeah. So maybe one of our listeners knows with absolute certainty. Maybe Greg Egan can come on the podcast and explain.
Yeah, even hopefully he doesn't mind that we were less impressed with Oracle, which, because I was trying to confirm early on that it was Alan Turing, I was, just trying to see if there'd been any online discussion about the story, and there was like a whole Reddit thread about it, and I think at least the initial poster was not very impressed with the story and thought it was maybe his weakest, which I'm definitely not crazy about it.
Yeah, I liked it more than Silverfire.
Okay.
Just because I thought there was more interesting, more new, interesting stuff going on in it that kept my interest. But yeah, I agree. As I said, as a plot, it's a little bit all over the place.
Yeah, but in a way that to me feels like kind of a noble failure. That like I'm like, yeah, it doesn't work. But like if somebody asked me if they should read it, I would say, well, it kind of doesn't add up to it's not more than the sum of its parts, but it's interesting to read.
Yeah, like what other story are you going to read about Alan Turing versus C.S. Lewis with the time traveling robot in many worlds interpretation and all this stuff? So, and there's this whole like debate about whether machines could be intelligent or conscious or not, with reference to Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I mean, there's just a lot of interesting stuff in the book, regardless of how well mixed in it is.
Yeah, exactly. I think any of those like individual scenes, I think is quite good. It's just then you put them all together and you're like, that's not really a fully successful story.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to Singleton, which actually we find out is set in the same universe as Oracle. So in Singleton, there's a character named Ben, and he's 18. When he's 18 years old, he's just walking to class or something, and he sees some criminals beating an innocent kitchen worker in an alleyway, possibly going to beat him to death. And even though Ben is kind of a nerdy teenager, something seizes him to intervene, and he charges into the fray. And this motivates a crowd of people who are watching to sort of prompts them into action as well. And he ends up possibly saving the life of this kitchen worker. And as a result of this experience, he, like, asking out the girl he has a crush on doesn't seem like such a big deal anymore. So he does that, and they end up getting together. And then his life is actually just going awesome. Everything's great. But he's sort of, he's into science, and he sort of becomes obsessed with the idea that there are, if you believe, again, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, that there are all sorts of other versions of himself who are not living great lives. And he feels like almost like survivor's guilt or something, some sort of feeling like, like every possibility or an infinite number of possibilities were going to happen. And it's just sort of the luck of the draw that he got this fortunate life. And he just feels sort of guilty about that, and is just sort of obsessed with that idea that there's all these other versions of himself out there, many of them suffering terribly. And then the story kind of goes from there. But so, Anthony, what are your kind of overall impressions of Singleton?
So this is the story I alluded to earlier, where I said I liked it until the ending, and the ending really kind of ruined it for me. And yeah, I think like this is, at least in this set, like the most interesting and in-depth exploration of many worlds theory and sort of the implications of that. And again, you could argue that it's even before you get to the ending, it's like a little bit overfull, because it's like, it's this guy wrestling with these questions, but then it's this whole story about parenthood, about like creating a robot, a robot daughter, like, it's basically somebody who has like a form of artificial intelligence, but then this specific daughter also has a device called a cusp, which, as we were talking about with Helen, like there's no branching, essentially. Whatever decisions are made here, they're sort of made in every universe. And so that's a lot, but I think it was a lot in a way that worked for me. But then at the end, there's this whole thing where Helen runs away, is captured by a sex trafficker, and then basically says, "Oh, I want to continue like spreading the cusp technology." And I mean, I guess that as an ending in theory is not impossible to pull off, but it just is like 3 pages where, just so much happens, and it goes from like, he's looking for Helen, finds Helen, she's like naked and clearly has been like abused, and then like rescues her, and then they're like going, like driving away, and she seems essentially like unbothered or untraumatized with what's happened, and it just comes to this sort of realization of what she wants to do with her life. And I just found all of that in such a compressed space to not be believable at all.
Yeah, I agree with you. This was another one where the ending, felt kind of abrupt. I mean, especially in contrast to like how like deliberate the pace is in the early stages, and then it just feels like it gets faster and faster toward the end, and so it's just kind of feels perfunctory. So I definitely agree with you about like I feel like how much time, how many pages are devoted to each section of his life should have been smoothed out some more, so that it didn't feel so rushed at the end. If it wasn't 100% clear there, we start off with him as a teenager, and then each section jumps ahead roughly 7 years or so. So we see his whole kind of life until he's a middle-aged father. And also, if it wasn't clear, so the robot daughter Helen he creates is the same Helen that we saw in the last story in Oracle.
I feel so dumb.
Um,
I did not realize that.
oh yeah, okay. Well, so I mean, that might be a part of, because I felt like the ending was sort of weird anyway. I mean, I think thematically, I can see where he's going because um, Ben creates this daughter who can make decisions that really matter in a way that normal people can't. Because if you accept this many worlds idea, any choice you make is sort of canceled out by all the other different choices that all the other different versions of yourself made. And Helen will not experience that. Any choice that she makes is the only choice that any version of her will experience. That's what this cusp thing, this quantum singleton processor or something, that's what it does. And so the fact that she's made all these poor choices by the end of the story, but accepts them and lives with them and doesn't want and wants other people to be able to make meaningful choices too, I think is like thematically and in principle a good ending. It's just kind of like too rushed and too kind of too all over the place. But I think it, like, if it were just sort of, yeah, like kind of slowed down and developed more, I think plot wise it's fine. But then what happens at the very end is that she says, okay, I'm going to basically invent time travel or travel to other universes so that I can spread the cusp technology around. And I felt like that was sort of random, and it kind of like works a little bit better because I read the last story and I'm like, oh, okay, this is like tying in. This is like a Pulp Fiction kind of thing where, okay, we've come back to the beginning again. But if you didn't make that connection between the two stories, I can imagine that seemed really, really random at the end.
It did. And I think both because that's just such a big idea to drop kind of, in like a paragraph and then you end the story. And then also I think just having it kind of come right after this scene of sort of implied sexual abuse and rape, like it just felt like such a whiplash. I think it's also because I mentioned, being a little blind to like first person versus third person. I'm also, not great with remembering names. But as soon as you said it, I was like, wait, oh, Helen, oh my God. It feels, again, like so obvious now that you've pointed it out, but I totally did not catch that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I liked this story a lot. I just think this idea of the cusp, this device that lets you make meaningful choices within the context of a many worlds cosmology, I think is totally fascinating. I'm really glad that he came back and explored that idea in more detail. So I was a pretty big fan of the story overall, with again, like the ending, like, yeah, like felt just sort of perfunctory and a little bit odd and random. But it didn't, it didn't spoil my enjoyment of the story overall. The way that it seems to have for you.
Yeah, I think again because maybe it just, and I mean, I guess I'd be interested in going back, although also maybe it wouldn't redeem it entirely for me because it's essentially just fusing two somewhat unsatisfying stories together. So it doesn't necessarily fully help, but that does make it a little bit more interesting, at least to see how the Helen of Singleton then feeds into the Helen of Oracle.
Yeah, well, maybe you can reread the stories, and if you have any, if it changes your opinion at all, we can talk about it on our next Greg Egan episode, which we'll be doing a part 3. But yeah, I just like this idea of the cusp is something I don't think I've ever seen before in science fiction, and so you get a lot of points from me when you come up with some science fiction concept like that I've never read before.
Yeah, and I think the thing it does really well, which is also true with the other Greg Egan stories that are more about sort of like, biology, is that it's not satisfied with just saying, hey, you don't have free will. It's also saying, okay, let's say you believe that. Now what? How do you live your life? How do you make sense of that? How do you reconcile yourself to that? And I think a lot of the second half of the story is about that.
Mm-hmm. I'm just looking at my notes here. I'll just mention this was another example of Greg Egan throwing in a ridiculous science fiction thing.
Oh, really?
So there's a line where and this has really nothing to do with anything else in the story, but so the main character, Ben, he picks up an anthology of alternate history stories entitled "My God, It's Full of SARS." This is SARS, TSARS, like Russian rulers. This is, if you don't know, it's a play on the line from 2001. My God, it's full of stars, STARS. But so this is the description of the book. What if Gandhi had been a ruthless soldier of fortune? What if Theodore Roosevelt had faced a Martian invasion? What if the Nazis had had Janet Jackson's choreographer? And so again, this is just like so silly that it like kind of undermines my suspension of disbelief. And so, yeah, I know that that Greg Egan is contemptuous of the sort of pulpy cheesiness of a lot of science fiction, but like sort of genre science fiction. But I wish he would restrain his impulse to put this sort of broad satire into his otherwise very serious stories.
I think also when you see, maybe at least for me, if you see it once, the same thing with the sort of like cardboard cutout, silly postmodern theorist characters is that's fine. They serve a function in the story. When it starts to become a repeating trope, you're like, all right, buddy, we get it.
Yeah. I mean, maybe like how far, like probably for him, it was like 10 years apart or something. But, like since we're reading all these stories one after another, even these like little winking things, kind of stand out more than they would if you were reading these stories as they came out in the magazines or whatever.
Totally.
Okay, so I guess that brings us to our last story in this batch. It's called Dark Integers. And so this is a sequel to the story Luminous that we talked about in our last episode, last Greg Egan episode. Okay, and so in this universe, it's very hard to explain, but somehow doing math allows you to alter the fabric of reality. It's now been like 5 months since I read Luminous, so if you want my best attempt at an explanation, maybe go back and listen to the last episode, because I am even more unclear about it now than I was then. But basically all you need to know is that the mathematician heroes, they discovered like basically what amounts to a parallel universe that has different that operates according to different mathematical principles, and the two universes are kind of like at war in a way where if you perform certain calculations, it kind of like takes territory away from one or the other. And so you could potentially destroy the other universe if you're not careful by solving the wrong obscure math problems. And so in the last story, they had kind of worked out a truce with this other universe. But in this story, their liaison from the other universe contacts our hero, Bruno. Like Bruno and Allison are basically the main characters, and tells Bruno that some sort of incursion has been made into their universe by someone in his universe, and they want him to fix it so that it doesn't spiral into some, open war between the two universes. So Anthony, I remember you really liked Luminous a lot. So how did you feel about Dark Integers?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because I think, on a basic level, like even these are, things that could only exist as science fiction stories, but I think of them also as like Greg Egan's Hollywood blockbuster mode, because they're just, maybe it's partly because I just experienced them as like, because a lot of the math stuff I can only sort of grasp in a very loose way. So then it just becomes about these sort of like, two dueling realities. And so they read in a lot of ways more like action adventure stories than I think a lot of his other stories do. And I think I particularly appreciated Luminous because, it came after a lot of these very dark, serious, fairly realistic short stories. And it was this longer action adventure story that still had these sort of fairly provocative concepts. And Dark Integers, I liked for a lot of the reasons that I liked Luminous, but sort of similar to a lot of Hollywood sequels, it did feel a little bit like diminishing returns. Like I was like, okay, this stuff I know a lot. there was also a sense of trying to remember like the details of Luminous, particularly the math stuff, so my sort of very short version, as I recall it, is essentially the idea that there's like very high level advanced math that is sort of not set, that was like sort of not set after the Big Bang. And so it's sort of indeterminate. And then when you do the math, you sort of like lock in certain, like physical laws in the universe. And so when you have these different universes, basically doing the math and getting the answer, you're reclaiming space from the other universe, which again, as I say it out loud, it just seems very complicated and strange, but then leads to these, because I'm especially in Luminous, these kind of high drama scenes of like people sitting at computers doing math because like they're trying to protect their universe.
Yeah. So I guess as you're talking, it's making me remember. So in Luminous, I feel like there was some like cool cyberpunkish stuff. So like in the first, in the opening scene, there's like this corporate mercenary who's trying to like cut a microchip or something out of Bruno, and he splashes blood on them and infects them with a virus that causes them to basically melt or something like that.
Yeah.
Is there anything like that in Dark Integers?
No.
Any of that kind of cyberpunk stuff?
No, you're right that this is because yeah, in Luminous, I guess the thing that made it even more sort of Hollywood blockbuster is that there is this other company that's chasing them down, trying to basically, I guess, kind of steal their knowledge and then productize it in a way that's probably incredibly dangerous. And that company still sort of exists in the background of this story, but they're not really a presence as the antagonist. And so the antagonist in this one is just basically the people who exist in the other universe, the Farsiders.
Yeah, so I guess like thinking back on that other story, I think it was a little more exciting to me with the mercenary and the industrial algebra, and they sort of have to sneak into this like Chinese computer lab to use their computer and stuff like that. And I guess like thinking, like comparing it in my head now to this one, I feel like this one feels a lot more like tame in comparison, like, like bad stuff. Like so basically what happens in the plot is that Bruno goes to run down where this incursion is coming from. And so there's this scientist named Tim who is kind of and Bruno and Allison have kept their work secret. Nobody else knows that they have, made this discovery that has all this potential and has reached this detente with this parallel universe and stuff like that. And but Tim has kind of independently replicated a lot of their work and in some ways gone even further than they had. And so they really need to deal with him. And so Bruno, I guess there's a little bit of sort of like thrillerish kind of stuff where he's installs like some sort of spyware on Tim's computer and stuff, but Tim like sees right through this and they need to bring Tim in. And so Bruno like explains everything to him, and Tim basically joins their little cabal that they've got going on. And I guess that's sort of an issue I have with the story, is that I think things are maybe just a little too easy for the characters throughout the story. What do you think about that?
No,
Anthony?
I think that's right. And that, I mean, certainly also I could not, describe any Bruno, Allison, or Tim really as characters. Like they don't have much personality. They sort of have functions in the plot. And I think you're also right that there's just, I think I'd forgotten a lot of sort of the additional drama in Luminous. And I guess part of that is that, there is all this sort of cyberpunky, actiony kind of stuff and espionage stuff that then leads to this, kind of abstract, but also, at least for me, very exciting climax around math. And then taking that up in Dark Integers, it feels like he's much more that all the drama comes from, the revelation at the end of Luminous of these two different universes, and that he's very interested in the relationship between, the two universes. How can they trust each other? Which, I mean, it reminded me in some ways of like some of the later books in the Three Body Problem trilogy, which are kind of that same question of like, these are like existential questions of can we, trust these sort of extraterrestrial civilizations that could wipe us out, but maybe we could wipe them out. And I found that like interesting, but I agree that maybe he invested a little too much. I don't know. I mean, maybe I don't know that there's a better version of the story, but it does have a lot less drama, and that the tension is all from this sort of intellectual side and from these sort of fairly abstract antagonists of the Farsiders versus the more conventionally entertaining stuff in Luminous.
Yeah, I mean, but it did sort of seem to me that things were too easy for the characters. So like, Bruno, has this sort of brewing conflict with Tim, but then that gets resolved pretty easily. And then there's this sort of subplot with Bruno's wife where she's like just upset and suspicious, and he's keeping secrets from her about this, this like math conflict that he has going on. But then that ends up getting resolved pretty easily. And then, the Farsiders are attacking, and to be fair, thousands of people are killed, but then it seems like that got resolved pretty easily too. I feel like maybe, like sort of again with Greg Egan not going for the emotion, like ratcheting up the emotions to 11 kind of thing. I think maybe the emotions needed to get ratcheted up in this story somehow, a little bit more than they were.
Yeah, there's things that just feel a bit anticlimactic, like that after Bruno, I know that it is like that like Bruno being able to get like basically tap Tim's laptop. Like there's a lot of stuff about meeting Tim, a lot of stuff about pretending to be drunk, but then once they fall asleep, he's like, all right, and then I just slap this thing on the on the laptop, which feels too easy. And then when like Tim figures it out again, yeah, it doesn't feel like there's not more conflict there. It's just Bruno kind of just tells him, and Tim's like, oh, okay, you sign me up. And then I think probably the biggest one problem for me was the relationship with the wife, because that's what it ends on. And that, the final sentence is basically Bruno beginning to tell Kate the story of what's happened. And I think it's a nice moment. I think like that last sentence is a great last sentence, but we really don't know that much about Kate. And that also then even in that last scene, there's this whole thing where like, anyway, Kate was okay with the fact that I told her I'd tell her like, in a couple days after like I disappeared and like all these other crazy things happened. But I said, hold on for a couple days, and she just was fine with it. And I don't know that I believe that it was quite that easy.
Mm-hmm. There was also all this stuff I thought was really interesting where, Tim's advances they're somehow able to image the Farsider dimension, and so they see that like the Farsiders, like their planets are a lot closer together, and it doesn't correspond, in terms of the planets and the suns and stuff like that, the stars, it doesn't correspond to our dimension. And Bruno had previously believed that the Farsiders had no knowledge of our existence until he and Allison had used the Luminous computer to try to, it was called sealing the defect, was all the stuff that happened in the previous story, that's what alerted the Farsiders to our existence. And that's where this, relationship began. But in this story, they find out that no, actually, it seems like the Farsiders have known about our world for like centuries or something and have been tracking it in their spaceship. And all that stuff I thought was really intriguing. And then the story ended without really explaining or exploring any of that. So I still don't know how, like, what are the implications of the Farsiders knowing about us and tracking us and keeping it secret and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I mean, that scene where they sort of reveal that, their planets are in completely different locations. There's no way that we could have this sort of essentially instantaneous conversation if they were on their planet. So they must be, like in a spaceship that's just sort of like tracing a parallel path through the solar system as Earth. That was probably my favorite part of the story. It was like really interesting. And then, like you said, it sort of doesn't lead anywhere. It sort of informs the later scenes with dealing with Sam, because there's just this sense of, oh, like, we don't understand them. We don't know exactly what they want. So it creates a greater sense of menace and suspense, but then like you said, it sort of gets resolved pretty easily.
Yeah, and Sam, if we didn't say, is the Farsighter liaison that Bruno is dealing with, and he seems totally chill too. It's like everyone in the story is just really really a pleasure to deal with. So I think the story just needed some character who's just a little bit more confrontational or something, causes some more drama or something, because everyone's just a little too nice in this version of the story, I think.
Yeah, and this is in a story where thousands of people die, but it seems like even that is like relatively low drama. There's definitely actually, I did also kind of like the scene where Bruno is in the middle of a hike with his wife trying to like rebuild their relationship, and suddenly he finds out what's happening. He's like, okay, I gotta leave you. You gotta catch a cab if you're not willing to run with me. And that was like, it felt like it was kind of from a different story, but on its own, it was like pretty funny and helped to kind of amp up the drama. But then, there's this whole exchange where Sam is like, hey, this wasn't my idea. And Bruno's like, yeah, I assumed it wasn't your idea. And they're weirdly blasé about the, destruction that's been happening in the background.
Well, and I think the fact that 5,000 people or so get killed, would have more impact, except the stakes that were established at the beginning were the entire universe getting wiped out. So when what you're concerned about is the entire universe getting wiped out and then 5,000 people die, it's like, okay, well, this is so much better than I was afraid of. It doesn't seem that big of a deal.
Yeah, except that I think in both cases, both the entire universe and 5,000 people is such an abstract concept that it registers, but not as much as maybe it could have.
Yeah, well, I remember we were talking about this a little bit in relation to Greg Egan's story, Into Darkness, where he doesn't give the protagonist really any personal stake. Nobody he really cares about is at risk in the story, and that's the case here too. Like his wife or Allison or Tim are never really put in any direct physical danger or have anything particularly grueling emotionally that they have to go through or anything like that. And again, maybe Greg Egan feels like that kind of thing is sort of cheap Hollywood nonsense or something. But it did make the story feel, the fact that there's like no cheap Hollywood nonsense did make the story feel just a little bit quiet or understated or lacking in drama.
Yeah, I agree. I think, it doesn't, physical danger is one, or even if like you believed that Bruno and Kate's marriage was in real danger, as opposed to just being this kind of weird, tension in the background.
Yeah, or like if he had to sacrifice his marriage.
Yeah, exactly.
For the, there was some cost or something. But so I think, I enjoyed the story just fine. I did think it sort of made saving the universe feel like you're an IT professional fixing the server over the weekend or something. It was just so like matter of fact and like calm and professional. It didn't get me that excited. But so thinking back, I do like Luminous more. So I think I would recommend at least reading that one for sure.
And conversely, I think talking about Dark Integers has made me like it less. I enjoyed it and found it entertaining, but it feels like pretty inessential. Like it doesn't expand on the ideas in Luminous in any particularly interesting ways.
Mm-hmm. And I too, again, wish he had explored more about what was going on with the, the Farsighter dimension. It seems like there was some interesting possibilities there.
Yeah, and it didn't necessarily have to be a full reveal, but just a few more clues along the lines of what he revealed in terms of the planets, and if there could have just been some more things there, I think would have made this feel a little bit more fleshed out.
Mm-hmm. All right, so why don't we start wrapping this up? I think that's enough about Dark Integers. Um, I guess I'll say so. We will be coming back again for part 3, where we'll be finishing up the best of Greg Egan. So what we've got lined up for next time is Crystal Knights, Zero for Conduct, Bit Players, Uncanny Valley, 3 Attica, and Instantiation. I don't think I've ever read any of those, so it'll be interesting to finish up the book and check those out. So Anthony, do you have any other thoughts about Greg Egan having read these 6 stories?
I mean, even the ones that I think we criticized, I'm like glad I read them. Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, like as he's kind of started writing at a longer length, there are more maybe experiments that don't fully pan out. There are more things that I just would argue with in the stories, but I think that's also made them, more rewarding and interesting.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm really bullish on Greg Egan at this point. I mean, maybe it doesn't sound like it from some of my comments on these stories, but I mean, I do feel like they don't all work as stories for me in terms of having like a big punch at the end or anything, but like the ideas are so interesting, and all the stories have really interesting ideas. And at least at this moment, there's no other author I'm looking forward to reading more than finishing up this best of Greg Egan book. So yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to reading these next 6 stories, and I can only expect that my mind will continue to be blown. And again, ideas like the cusp, this thing that lets you make meaningful choices within the context of a many worlds cosmology, I think it's just awesome. And so I'm really glad I read these stories, and yeah, it's definitely made me want to read more Greg Egan and maybe even check out some of his novels, which actually reminds me, Anthony, you mentioned over email that you actually read a Greg Egan novel since our last episode. So would you recommend his novels? How are you feeling about Greg Egan as a short story writer versus a novelist at this point?
So I read Quarantine, which I think is either his first or one of his first books. I think kind of the first one to kind of make an impact in the genre, at least. And I liked it a lot. I think it has a lot of the same, both like kind of virtues and weaknesses as his short fiction. In that, like, I mean, the ideas are incredible. It's especially if you find the many worlds stuff in Singleton interesting. This is like an even more complex exploration of many worlds. I think it does suffer a little bit from like certain ideas or plot developments kind of get, they happen very quickly and are not like there's sections of the book that feel kind of abrupt or rushed. But overall, I really liked it for basically the same reasons I like so many of his stories.
Yeah, I was just to get ready for this, I was reading through a bunch of Greg Egan interviews, and some of the titles that kept popping up were like Diaspora and Permutation City. There was one other early one, I'm blanking on the title, that got brought up a lot. So yeah, I think probably I would like to check out some of his novels at some point.
Well, we can do another episode.
Plenty more Greg Egan stories to discuss. He's actually published a lot of stories since the stories in this book too. So there's no shortage of Greg Egan material for us to talk about if people are interested. But yeah, so and again, we'll be back with part 3. Hopefully, it will not be 5 months from now. I was telling Anthony, now that my 1-year-old daughter is in daycare, it'll make it a lot easier for me to get through the rest of this book in a more reasonable amount of time. So yeah, definitely looking forward to coming back and doing that. So everyone keep an eye out for that. And so again, I've been here with my good friend Anthony Ha, talking about the best of Greg Egan. So Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This has been super fun.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Anthony Ha for joining us on the show. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please support us on Patreon over at patreon.com/geeks or via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.